Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to acknowledge the struggle and freedom of those in the Black and African American community. The Freedom Trail has the Amistad Committee has the oversight of the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Today, we're going to have a wonderful conversation with the Executive Director of the Old State House, Sally Whipple. But before we get to that, little housekeeping. Please remember to fill out the survey. Let us know how we're doing and what else you would like to see on the program. Also, we are looking for judges for Connecticut History Day. So if you are interested and available and you love history, please sign up to judge for History Day. As I said, we are here with Sally Whipple. Sally Whipple is the Executive Director of the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House in Hartford. She serves on the Secretary of the State's Civic Health Advisory Group, the State Social Studies Standards Steering Committee, the Connecticut Semi-Quincentennial Commission, and as a governor's appointee to the Connecticut State Library Board. Board membership includes the Connecticut Association for the Study of Connecticut History, Discovering Amistad Incorporated, and the Coatesville Heritage Partnership. Previous board service includes Chair of Connecticut Humanities, President of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and the Colchester Historical Society. Sally received a 2015 New England Museum Association Award of Excellence and 2021 Connecticut Council for the Social Studies Bruce Fraser Friend of the Social Studies Award. She has loved the Old State House since the third grade and is inspired every day by all that it has to teach us. Sally, welcome. We're looking forward to how you are going to connect historical stories and happenings that went on at the Connecticut Old State House. Sally, you are muted.
Tammy. Thank you so much. It's always great to talk with you and always wonderful to talk about Connecticut's Old State House. I've got some slides that I'd like to share and some stories about the Old State House that connect it to the Freedom Trail. Of all of the historic sites in Connecticut, Connecticut's Old State House really stands alone. Between 1796 and 1878, the decisions made and the actions taken in this building touched every person in the state and impacted every town and city. Its 83 years of activities are still with us, having reverberated across generations, leaving their marks on the laws, schools, houses of worship, modes of transportation, municipal boundaries, ideas of justice, elections, housing and retail practices, and traditions of government that we experience today. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the Old State House stories related to the Connecticut Freedom Trail, but these stories really can't be confined to one category or one trail. They represent our full history in Connecticut. The land underneath the Old State House has a very long history of use by indigenous peoples, and in 1636, Thomas Hooker and his followers came from Massachusetts and took this plot of land as their own, entering into an uneasy relationship with Dutch traders who had claimed land and resources before them. The building has always been, the site has always been the site of government buildings. They have occupied this space since that time in 1636. There was a meeting house where Hooker preached the importance of government formed by the free consent of the people. There was a 1720 state capitol that stood through the Revolution. And then this building, which was erected in 1796 as a sort of civic temple on a hill, looking down on a busy Connecticut River port. This state house was filled to the brim with all three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, as well as the earliest version of the Connecticut State Library and a museum of curiosities featuring a two-headed calf. This is the earliest known image of the new Old State House as it looked upon completion. There was no cupola, no statue of justice, no balustrade along the roof's edge. Those came later, around 1827. Nonetheless, it was always an impressive federal building. It was most likely designed by Charles Bulfinch, who also planned the Boston State House and the first dome in our nation's capital. Former state historian Walt Woodward has said that the Old State House was Connecticut's way of telling the world that the land of steady habits knew how to govern. We had it all figured out. But did we really? At the time, Connecticut had two state capitals, Hartford and New Haven. For years, the legislature met in Hartford at the old State House in May and switched to a second house on the New Haven Green in October. Later, odd year sessions took place in Hartford, even year sessions in New Haven. It wasn't until 1878 that we declared one state capital in Hartford and started conducting the state's business in the current Capitol building. Between 1796 and 1878, the New Haven Capitol and this big, perfectly symmetrical federal brick box in the middle of Hartford buzzed with activity. The walls of both capitals witnessed the waxing and waning of rights, bad decisions, good decisions, repealed decisions, petitions from citizens agitating for change, bills raised to stop or start change, and votes cast for and against war, freedom, temperance, new schools, better schools, roads, bridges, taxation, and smaller issues such as how to tag dogs to prevent the spread of rabies. The actions taken in both state houses are recorded in newspapers, public records, court records, biographies, in so many places on so many topics. Our job at Connecticut's Old State House is to tell those stories, but the stories cannot be confined to the activities in the building. There was a big changing world beyond the building's walls and gates. As elected officials and judges pushed laws and court decisions out into that world, ideas and issues, complaints and calls for action flowed in from all corners of the state. Both state houses were mixing bowls where, ideally, the needs and desires of constituents served as ingredients for state decisions. We think of Connecticut's Old State House as the place where history and civics meet. You can't understand the world without history, and you can't change it without civics. You need to know how government works, to be sure. The three branches, how a bill is passed, those are all important to know. But you also need to possess civic skills, awareness, persuasion, how to identify, learn about, and define issues of importance, public speaking, team building, networking, getting the word out, finding support, working across differences, persistence, and confidence. The stories we tell at the Old State House are the stories of people using their civic skills to change the world. Some of the stories are of prominent white men who served in the building as judges, legislators, and governors. Their stories of state representatives such as P.T. Barnum and Noah Webster, are imprinted on the building and the state. But there are other stories less well known that are equally imprinted on the state. The stories of men and women whose names we may never know, as well as the stories of people who made themselves known by the action they took to engage with state government and work across differences to make Connecticut a better place for everyone. These are just some of the people whose stories played out in Connecticut's Old State House in the 1830s. Their stories span the state, the nation, and the world, reaching from Hartford, Connecticut, to places such as Norfolk, Maryland, Africa, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Cuba, New Haven, Farmington, and on and on. The Reverend James Pennington, Sarah Harris Fairweather, Sengbe Pia, and Deacon James Mars left lasting marks on the state. Pennington and Mars wrote narratives about their enslavement and freedom. Pennington and Fairweather each knew Frederick Douglass. Sengbe Pia led a revolt that shifted the way some people thought about abolition and slavery. Their stories are rich and deep and interconnected, and they don't scratch the surface of Connecticut's network of people and stories. And this talk won't scratch the surface of these people or their stories or the sites along the Connecticut Freedom Trail, but it's a start. As I've said, all three branches of government once met in the Old State House. Today's restored legislative chambers and courtroom help us imagine the settings for some of Connecticut's most meaningful events. The Senate chamber, with some original furnishings and an original Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, provides a glimpse into the meeting room of some of the state's most elite leaders. These were educated men with Revolutionary War experiences, familial ties, congregational church memberships, federal party affiliations, and wealth. When the building first opened and the years shortly after, they met in this room with no public observation or interference, making decisions that affected all Connecticutans. By about 1815, however, their power had ebbed. New men took on leadership in 1818, and they held Connecticut's first constitutional convention in the old State House. This first Connecticut Constitution changed many aspects of our state's government, but three changes stand out. First, the Constitution disestablished the Congregational Church, meaning that it was no longer the official church of the state. Second, it required the Senate to allow the public in to the room to hear deliberations. The banister in this picture separating the public benches from the Senate seats is the physical embodiment of that decision. Third, the new Constitution expanded the vote for white men and at the same time disenfranchised Black men. With the stroke of a pen, the word white was added to Connecticut's voting requirements, and Black men, some of whom had fought in the Revolution or were the sons and grandsons of veterans, lost their vote. Even though they fulfilled all other voting qualifications, they were disenfranchised by Connecticut's first Constitution. Now, you can tell this story of Black suffrage in Connecticut in a couple of ways. You can fast forward to 1865 and talk about P.T. Barnum's impassioned speech on the House floor, where he called for a constitutional amendment to reinstate Black male suffrage in Connecticut. You can talk about Governor Buckingham's backing of the amendment and how the legislature voted to send the amendment to referendum. And you can talk about how the white male voters of Connecticut voted that amendment down, leaving Black Connecticutans without voting rights until they were reinstated by their federal Constitution's 15th Amendment in 1870. But that's only part of the story. It focuses on the big names who took actions 4 decades after the right to vote was last, without noting the teams of people from all over Connecticut who pushed long and hard for reinstated suffrage. As soon as the vote was taken away, the fight to reinstate it began. A petition movement grew over time, with petitions sent to the General Assembly from across the state over the course of many years. In Hartford, this man, James Mars, used his considerable civic skills to gather supportive signatures and petition the state. He's petitioned the state several times in the early 1840s. He knew how laws could both benefit and hurt people. His own emancipation from slavery came as a result of Connecticut's 1784 Gradual Emancipation Act, which stated that enslaved people born after March 1st, 1784, would be freed at 25 years of age. Despite that law, young Mars, born in 1790, had to fight his enslaver, who sought to elude the Connecticut law by transporting Mars to Virginia before he turned 25. With help from people in Norwalk, Mars eluded Thompson, earning his freedom, going on to serve as a persistent petitioner for Black suffrage. Here he used civic skills such as gathering a network and a team, understanding what was going on around him, being aware, being informed, and thinking through how he could best gain and maintain his freedom. In 1838, the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society published examples of petitions that people could sign and send to the state legislature. One called for the equal treatment of Black Connecticutans, and another called for voting rights for Connecticut men, irrespective of color. Mars put the pre-printed suffrage petition to good use between 1840 and 1843. He gathered 72 signatures from people of color in Hartford and submitted his first petition to the General Assembly in 1840. This would have gone to the legislature in New Haven because it was an even year. His 1841 and 1843 petitions came to Hartford's Old State House, and his 1842 and 44 petitions went back to New Haven. None of these petitions or the ones to follow convinced the legislature to bring an amendment before the people of Connecticut. The 1842 petition from Mars and other Hartford residents wasn't rejected out of hand, but no action was taken. In 1843, a Mars petition called for a repeal of, quote, all laws making distinction among our colored citizens on account of color. An 1844 petition abandoned the pre-printed form and came to the General Assembly as a handwritten statement signed by 80 Black men in Hartford who were, quote, aggrieved by the existence of the word white in the state constitution. Mars did not sign that petition. No Hartford petition was submitted in 1845. In 1846, Mars moved to Massachusetts, where he could vote. A few years before James Mars began his legislative petition movement in Hartford, he had some involvement with the court. In 1837, his wife, Mrs. Mars, was taking in wash for a man named James Bullock, a Georgian man with a home in Hartford. Whenever Bullock traveled back to Georgia from Hartford, he left an enslaved woman named Nancy Jackson with his family. When he eventually decided to bring Jackson back to Georgia with him, she was determined to challenge his right to enslave her. James Mars signed the paper she needed to go to court. He told the story about this in his narrative, starting with the 10 days between his signing of the paper and the court date. I'm going to read a little bit from his narrative. During those 10 days, I had a fair opportunity to see how strong a hold slavery had on the feelings of the people in Hartford. I was frowned upon. I was blamed. I was told that I had done wrong. The house where I lived would be pulled down. I should be mobbed, and all kinds of scarecrows were talked about, and this by men of wealth and standing. I kept on about my work, not much alarmed. The 10 days passed away. The Supreme Court of Error sat. Judge Williams was chief judge. The case was argued on both sides. When the plea ended, then came the decision. 2 of the court would send Nancy back to slavery. 2 were for her release. We shall hear from Williams tomorrow at 8 o'clock. At the time appointed, all were in attendance to hear from Judge Williams. The judge said that slavery was tolerated in some of the states, but it was not now tolerated in this state. We all like to be free. This girl would like to be free. He said she should be free. The law of the state made her free when brought here by her master. This made a change in the feelings of the people. I could pass along the streets in quiet. Nancy said when she went into the courthouse on that last day, she had 2 large pills of opium. Had she been sentenced to go back, she should have swallowed both of them before she left the courthouse. That happened in this courtroom that you're seeing now. This courtroom saw many trials. And a few years before Nancy Jackson won her case for freedom, one of Prudence Crandall's trials took place here. Her case concerned her disregard of Connecticut's 1833 Black Law, which sought to close her school for Black women in Canterbury, Connecticut. The Black Law had been passed in the legislative chambers of the old State House, and this is the House of Representatives as it looks restored today. The Black Law prohibited Connecticut schools from educating people of color from out of state unless legally permitted by their towns. This law effectively closed Crandall School and sent her case to trial. 5 years after passing the Black Law in 1838, the law was repealed in the New Haven State House. One of the men responsible for passing it to begin with, Philip Pearl Jr., said, "I could weep tears of blood for the part I took in that matter. I now regard that law as utterly abominable." And it was abominable. By refusing to invest in the education of young Black women, Connecticut and the nation lost opportunities for more Crandall students to share their knowledge and skills with people across the country. It was a young Black woman, Sarah Harris, pictured here later in life, who pushed Crandall to enroll students of color in her school. She was the catalyst that started this whole thing. Those who attended the school, even under the duress of physical attacks, became activists, pursuing education, advancing ideas in newspapers, teaching others, and speaking out on matters of importance. These women learned and they made great change throughout the country. And had Crandall been able to keep her school open, who knows what else might have been accomplished. The Crandall story is a reminder of how people who play a role in one story can show up in other roles in different stories. William Walcott Ellsworth represented Prudence Crandall in court. A few years later, James Mars visited Ellsworth's law office to sign the papers that allowed Nancy Jackson to sue for her freedom. Andrew Judson on the right, the person who agitated for the black law and led the attacks on Crandall and her students, just a few years later reappeared at the old State House presiding over the Amistad trials. In 1839, he sized up and defined the situation of the Amistad in hearings aboard ships in New London. He was called there when the Amistad was first pulled into New London, and he went down there to figure out exactly what was going on. There, he determined that the Africans should be held in a New Haven jail. Next, in Hartford, he heard the beginnings of the cases, dismissed charges of mutiny and murder against the Africans, and finally ruled in favor of the Africans at court in New Haven in 1840. His decision was that they should go free and return to Africa. From there, the case went to the Supreme Court on appeal. The Amistad men and children lived in Farmington to await results. After winning their case, some of the Africans set out on lecture circuits, raising funds for their return to Africa. The Amistad story is complicated and endlessly fascinating, as are all of these stories. We believe that the Hartford hearings started in the Senate chamber of the old State House before moving on to the courtroom. The courtroom during the trial was filled to suffocation during the trial, and the yard was packed with people eager to be just a small part of this wildly popular event. It is impossible to overestimate how interested people across the country and in the world were in this one trial. In this courtroom, you can imagine some of the Amistad Africans, men and children, in court, supported by American abolitionists and relying on their civic skills to win their freedom. Their leader, Sengbe Pia, spoke with such strength and conviction that Americans understood him, even though they could not speak his language. The Amistad men and children communicated effectively, persuaded people to support their cause, raised funds, remained focused and persistent, and worked with white and black abolitionists to win their freedom. They also built bonds with one another, working across their own many differences. They had come from different African villages, spoke different languages, were of different ages, and held different occupations at home: locksmiths, hunters, weavers, rice growers. But they joined forces for a common goal, and they won. The Amistad Africans came to Connecticut in 1839, and I always find it interesting and useful to think about the community that they came into. Hartford and other cities in Connecticut had very strong black communities. By the time the Amistad Africans case came to Hartford, the state capital had experienced a decade marked by Prudence Crandall and her students, by Nancy Jackson, the start of a petition movement to reinstate black suffrage, 2 attacks on the Talcott Street Church and its members, and countless other events that revealed legal and social interactions among free and enslaved people of color, white people, the legislature, courts, and the executive branch. Into this story stepped Reverend Pennington, newly appointed to the Talcott Street Church, one of the nation's first black churches and a center of anti-slavery activity. His church had a legacy of activism and education, starting schools, supporting suffrage, pushing back on laws that discriminated against people of color, and sending representatives from the church to colored conventions. The church stepped up, supporting the Amistad Africans, like other churches across the state and nation. When the Africans returned home, 2 members of the Talcott Street Church went with them. Sometimes justice was served in the old State House courtroom, and sometimes it was not. Today, a fiberglass replica of Justice sits on top of the old State House cupola. The original wooden Justice is preserved in the Legislative Hall of the old State House. On December 2nd, 1859, at 2 in the morning, party goers across the street from the old State House saw a light in the cupola and called for the police. The police found two men in the belfry. Samson Easton. He was a black resident of Hartford, and he was the son of one of the first ministers of the Talcott Street Church, Hosea Easton, who came from a long line of activists. And Samson was accompanied by his white assistant from New Haven, a man named Charles Boyle. According to the newspaper, they had completed their business of draping the figure of Justice upon the cupola with sable fabric in view of the execution, which was to take place in Charleston, Virginia, the next day. The execution set to take place was that of Torrington-born John Brown. He was being executed for his role in the Harper's Ferry attack. The message that Easton and Boyle intended to send by draping Justice in black was that Justice was in mourning. The two men were arrested and let go without charge later that day. By the way, the image, this very famous image of John Brown, was taken around 1846 in Hartford. It's the work of Augustus Washington, a Hartford daguerreotypist whose studio stood near the old State House. He was one of the finest photographers in the city, and this image is now in the National Portrait Gallery. In addition to his well-regarded work, Washington taught at a black school in Hartford, served in the Talcott Street Church, worked as an abolitionist, and eventually moved to Liberia, where he served in the House of Representatives and Senate. Today, I focus on Hartford stories, on stories that touch the old State House. There are so many more to discover and tell, and they stretch across the state. I'd like to close this part of the program with a thank you to James Mars, who we talked about earlier. In about 1989, I was working at the Noah Webster House, and I wanted to do an exhibit about African Americans in colonial West Hartford. I was told by a couple of people that there were no African Americans in colonial West Hartford. But with the help of the West Hartford African American Social and Cultural Organization, we proved these people wrong. One of the first sources I found and looked to was James Mars' narrative about his enslavement and freedom in Connecticut. He started his book by writing, "When I made my mind up to write this story, it was not to publish it, but it was at the request of my sister that lived in Africa and has lived there more than 30 years. She had heard our parents tell about our being slaves, but she was not born until a number of years after they were free. When the war in which we are now engaged began, the thought came to her mind that her parents and her brothers and sisters were once slaves, and she wrote to me from Africa for the story. When I had it written, I thought I would have it printed, and perhaps I might sell enough to pay the expenses, as many of the people now on the stage of life do not know that slavery ever lived in Connecticut." James Mars wrote those last words. As many of the people now on the stage of life do not know that slavery ever lived in Connecticut in 1864, just 16 years after Connecticut ended slavery. Back then, we started our exhibit with those words, a reminder of how easily and quickly history can be forgotten, ignored, tucked away, and how vital it is that we find it, question it, share it, and learn from it. All of it. The old State House is a vehicle for many, many stories. There are many lessons to be learned from the events that occurred there, from the people who worked there, for the people who came there to agitate for change. It has a long, long history, and there is so much more to discover about what happened within those walls. I would urge everybody to really make an attempt to try to learn as many stories as you can, to find those hidden stories, that need to be brought out into the sunlight. We're really happy that we're part of the Connecticut Freedom Trail at the Old State House, and we really look forward to doing more research that shows other connections to towns well beyond Hartford and how networks and people interconnected to change things for the better throughout the state. And I'm again very happy to be here and look forward to having a conversation.
Thank you so very much, Sally. That was very insightful and very informative. Let me ask that. Well, I'll give you a comment that's here from John Mills. He says that James Marr's work is freeing Nancy Jackson has always been his favorite story of his life and his accomplishments. He says he wished the broader story would be told, which is that Nancy Jackson was to be nanny to James Bullock's newborn Martha Bullock, who was Theodore Roosevelt's mom. So it's the making those historical connections is always so very important because all of these stories, even though most of them have been hidden, when you start to dig through them, you do find fascinating historical connections of either events or people. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's one of the most wonderful things about the Freedom Trail and about history in general is that once you start looking at one story, you can't help but see all of the connections across the state. And I think sometimes we feel growing up when we're learning about the past that people operated in these little silos and didn't really know each other. But once you look at these stories, you see the same names popping up over and over. You might see somebody like Philip Pearl, who led the passage of the Black Law, later change his mind. You'll
Mm,
see other people just making a trail through Connecticut. So, for example, you take Amos Beeman. Amos Beeman attended a black school in Colchester in the early 19th century. He went on to be in Hartford. He went on to New Haven. He served as a minister. He was an abolitionist, a leader. And you think about his trail sort of from the eastern part of the state to the western part of the state, the people he met, the people who impacted him, the people he impacted, the
mm,
ideas he spread, the ideas he took in. You think about all of those connections among people, and it makes you understand how much richer the past is. And I love that John Mills brought this up because I think that is one of the most important things to think about is how things didn't just happen one at a time.
mm,
Everything was strung together. Everything impacted everything else. And understanding um, connections that are sometimes thought of as fun facts, they're really important because they show how ideas form. And I love this idea of this continuity of what Nancy Jackson was meant to do um, and what she actually ended up doing and being.
awesome. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free. We have a few minutes left. Don't hesitate to put them into the chat and we will get them over to Sally. Sally, speaking of one of the historical connections, this is something we haven't been able to prove just yet, but doing research, thanks to John Mills, with Prince Mortimer and Venture Smith. Although there's nothing in writing that says that they actually knew each other, the similarities of their life are so strong. They both came from the same area of Africa and Guinea. They were both around the same age when they were brought to the Connecticut colony. So again, when doing that research, so it's fascinating to think of when, as the research continues, how that could actually be connected. That these two early individuals were actually known and actually may have worked together. And it's just the excitement of trying to find those historical connections. So you're right. It's not just fun, but it's very important because the parallels of their stories is just it's mind blowing. One was a prince that came here as a captive, enslaved individual who was able to go on and write the first story of their life, whereas the other came here enslaved, captive, but had a horrible, tragic ending. So it is very important to make those connections. Let's see, we do have a question. Can you comment on how often visitors are surprised to learn that there was slavery in Connecticut and that Black men may have been able to vote in Connecticut before 1818?
Well, I would say that that is very surprising to a lot of our visitors. I think well, it was surprising to me when I first learned about it. Um, I think it is that's one thing I really like about bringing people through the old state house because it's a way to help people learn things that they might never have thought about before or never knew before. And I think that when people learn something new like that, it kind of clicks something on in them like, oh, maybe the world isn't the way I thought it was. Or, boy, this is just not what I expected. We hear so many people, one of the most common things is, I never learned this in school.
Yeah.
And we hear that quite a bit from people. And you kind of hope that people will move forward with that new information and that new feeling of, wow, what did I miss out on because I was never taught this or I never pursued it on my own? So you kind of hope that people will learn something new that they hadn't anticipated, shift their view of the world a little bit, and then go on to help other people learn things that we all should know.
Yeah, I agree. And also, when learning this information, it makes the world a lot smaller in the sense of it helps us to appreciate we're not that different, that we're basically the same, but because of prejudices and so forth, that's when the separation comes into play. But again, we have another comment. John says, this was an amazing and informative presentation, and thank you so much for the work that you do, Sally. So you are very appreciated for the work that you do. Stephanie says that this just brings to mind how horrible Florida is for not teaching African American studies. This presentation is fabulous. So, what are your thoughts on that, Sally, of how African American studies should be taught or is not taught or is made an elective in some cases? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it always I never know the right way to say it because you don't want to sound I just want to say it is our history. This is all of our history. And to me, um it's not like just looking at black history or even though we've looked just at white history for so many years, but it's really thinking about how different groups of people interacted and intersected over the course of our history to tell one big story because there is no way you can understand what would an example be? Voting rights without understanding this history that happened in Connecticut. There is no way that you can understand the world we're living in now if you aren't understanding all of the different perspectives on this history. So everyone's going to bring a different perspective to what they're looking at. And everybody who lived at that time had a different perspective. But you've got to study everybody's history and you've got to understand how it all worked together. So as I said earlier, you could look at the fight for black suffrage as P.T. Barnum, leading the way to get the vote and Governor Buckingham working to get the vote back for black men. But it has been so easy to overlook all of the work that all of these people did over the years, not just James Mars in Hartford, but people across the state to explain the issue to people, to get them to sign petitions, to send them to the legislature. Can you imagine somebody in 1843 putting his name on a petition? Slavery is still legal in Connecticut in 1843. And here you are, a free black man, putting your name on a petition and saying, I deserve the right to vote. I mean, that is just so important to our understanding of how the state worked, how the people of the state worked. I like to imagine, you can say James Mars got 80 people to sign a petition, but now you have to imagine James Mars walking around to 80 people and or meeting them in a public gathering area and saying, look, this is really important. Can I please have your signature on this piece of paper? That is putting civic skills to use and thinking about how things actually happen on the ground, how James Mars actually did this, helps us understand how the state worked, how things move forward, and it also helps us understand how we can do the same thing today. These people serve as models for us today. So if you're only looking at one part of history or one group's history, you miss all of that, and we're better for knowing the full story. I don't know if that made sense. I hope
Oh,
it
no,
did.
that makes perfect sense because it speaks to representation, how representation really does matter. And it also speaks to James Mars and the others' courage because there was a law in 1740 that was put into play that a white person could approach a black person and demand an answer. And if they didn't get the answer they wanted or the response they expected, they could assault that person or even kill them without impunity. So it took a lot of courage for James Mars to walk up to these different 80 people and to try to get these signatures promote what was needed at that time. Okay, we have let's see. Nicole wants to know what is your favorite story from the old state house and mine. So I'll let you go first, Sally.
Wow, I would say my favorite story is the story we don't know yet. There is so much more to find out, and I am always curious, and hope I always will be curious about other stories that happen in the old state house. But I would say of the stories I do know about, I have to say, Nancy Jackson is my favorite story. I want to know more about how all of that happened, why all of that happened. I want to know more about the court's role in all of these stories because I think it surfaces in so many of these stories, and I think it's so good to know how the courts worked. But I loved her courage. I loved her facing her enslaver in court and working toward her own freedom. I love the community that came in around her to support her in this cause. And then there's the drama of her saying that she had opium in her pocket and she was ready to take it if she lost. And I think that that story gives you a sense of the motivations that people had, but the sense of the lengths people would go to, of the desire for freedom and full citizenship, of how it was everything to people. And I love that story because I think it has a lot of to teach, and it also provides insights into the hearts of people who were involved in these events at that time.
Yeah, it speaks to how the human spirit wants to be free, regardless of the hue of a person's skin. I will answer my question, my favorite story, in a moment because it actually leads to a great segue for later. So I'll get back to that, Nicole. Heidi would like to know about reasons why the Constitution specified white voters only, and how did Connecticut conclude that was a good idea?
I'm not really sure how to answer that question because I just don't know. I could give some answers, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to say something that wouldn't be quite right. But if anybody else can answer that question, I'd be glad to hear that.
Well, one word for me when I look at Heidi's question, I would say greed. Greed is usually the motivation of a lot of things. So we could say greed played a big role in that particular decision. There is a comment from Michael. It's amazing to know that Connecticut had and has so much to offer historically to this nation, yet we're not taught this in the education system. That should change. And he was very emphatic about that. And you're right, Michael, it should change because growing up in Mississippi, my great grandmother always had a saying: the flattest pancake has two sides, even if that pancake has a hole in it. So there's many sides of stories that need to be told so that we could have the whole story versus just seeing history through one particular lens. So you are so right about that.
And
All right.
I have to say, I think that is changing in Connecticut. I know it's changing in
Yeah.
Connecticut. You see a lot more professional development around this. I think some of us missed out on it, and we regret that. And now it's our chance to make sure that future students and current students have the opportunities that we didn't have.
Exactly. And I'm looking forward to us all being a part of that. To go back to Nicole's story, to Nicole's question, my favorite story would be of the court scene of the Africans in the courtroom when little Margot was there with a benefactor who was, at the time, she didn't understand the language and she was very much afraid, as she should have been, because at this point she had been separated from the elders and she was afraid, not knowing what was going on, surrounded by a sea of what she thought were pale-faced ghosts. So that would be my favorite story from the old state house. But there's so many others that also that I like the connections to, such as Prudence Crandall, how her story years ago, what the public thought would have influenced the outcome of the Amistad captives. So that would be my favorite story. But also, it makes a great segue because speaking of the Amistad, we have the Amistad trilogy coming up, where February, March, and April, we are going to have great presentations. For the month of February, you will hear Margot's story. You will, for the month of March, we will give a presentation from the author Marcus Rediker. And also, there'll be a little assignment with Marcus's because there is his film, The Ghost of Amistad, that he's released so that you can see that before his talk. And I'll remind you of that next month. And then in April, we have a wonderful twist where we will get to hear from the executive director of the Discovering Amistad, where she's going to give her perspective of being not only a Black woman as an executive director of such a historical undertaking, but she's going to also connect it to resiliency, which is what the Amistad story is all about. So that's why I wanted to wait a little bit to tell my part to make that segue. We have great and exciting programming coming up this year. We have authors, of we have descendants of individuals who are very prominent in Connecticut as well as U.S. history. So we're hoping that you will join us each fourth Tuesday of every month at noon to hear these conversations and to come out with your input and let us know what you think. And let us know if you're enjoying this and if we are contributing in a positive way. We would really love to hear that. Again, thank you so very much, Sally. We really appreciate you being here and sharing those wonderful connected stories of the old State House. Again, the upcoming programs will be February and Thursday. These are Tuesdays, every Tuesday in February at noon. So we're going to have Thursday, February 16th at 5 p.m., we have evening conversations where it's Beyond Black History Month, Educators in Conversation. This will be moderated by Dr. G. Duncan Harris with special guest Congresswoman Johanna Hayes. Thursday, February 23rd at 6:30 p.m., another evening conversation, The Many Colors of Justice, Black New Englanders in Connecticut's Colonial Course with Dr. Dominic DeBranket of Missouri Western State University. And Tuesday, February 28th or February 12th. We have two different dates there at noon. Okay, it'll be February at noon. Conversations at noon on the Freedom Trail, the Amistad Affair with Tammy Denise, Charles Warner, and Adrian Joy Burns. Sally, we so appreciate you being with us. Thank you so much for sharing your time and all of that wonderful information. Thank you so very much. There are no more questions or comments, so we will end the show here today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate you supporting the program. And until the next time.